Kayla had always believed the battlefield would be the place where her strength was proven, where the years of training under the watchful eyes of her elders would finally transform into honor, yet she had not expected destiny to strike in such a cruel and silent way, hidden under the very ground she trusted. The sky above the plains of Valor was covered with smoke trails from weapons, voices of clashing warriors echoed across the rocks, and Kayla ran with her squad, her spear gleaming as dust clung to her armor, but in one terrible moment her foot pressed down on a patch of soil that gave way beneath her, and before she could even draw breath the world erupted in fire and force. The blast flung her backward as if the ground itself had rejected her, her ears filled with a ringing that drowned the cries of her comrades, her vision blurred with dust and sparks, and when she tried to rise she found that her body no longer answered as it had a second before. For a moment she did not understand why her balance was gone, why pain was spreading like fire from her hip downward, until her gaze fell upon the terrible truth: her leg was no longer there. The soil where she had stood was blackened and torn, pieces of metal scattered like cruel seeds, and the very earth itself seemed to mock her with the finality of what had been taken. A rush of heat filled her chest as she pressed her hand against the ground to steady herself, but steadiness would not come, for her strength felt as though it was leaving her faster than the blood spilling onto the dust. The world around her had not stopped, her clan still battled their rivals, their cries and strikes echoing like thunder, but not one of them slowed for her, not one turned back with more than a fleeting look, for tradition was strong in her people, and a warrior who could no longer stand was seen as already lost, not through cruelty but through custom, and that truth sank deeper into her heart than even the pain of her wound. She thought of all she had hoped for leading her unit, proving herself before the council, earning the right to carve her name into the stone of heroes, but in that instant those hopes seemed to crumble into dust, as broken as the soil that had betrayed her step. Darkness pressed at the edge of her vision, whispering that it would be easier to surrender, to let the shadows take her and end the shame before it could begin, but somewhere within her a spark of defiance still flickered, refusing to allow her story to end on this battlefield without meaning. She clenched her jaw, forcing herself to remain awake though every breath was heavy, and she told herself silently that she was still alive, still breathing, and that meant her fight was not finished, even if her people might see her as finished already. Yet as she struggled to stay conscious, she could not escape the weight of their whispers, the words she had heard since childhood about broken warriors being burdens, about how those who could no longer fight were given a place of silence far from the center of life, their stories ending not in songs of glory but in forgotten corners of the clan's history. Her eyes filled with tears that she refused to let fall, for she would not allow the ground to see her weakness, but her heart twisted at the thought that her name would be erased from the songs before it was ever sung. Around her the battle shifted farther away, the dust settled, and the silence grew heavy, broken only by the faint sound of her own struggling breaths. She pressed her hand to the wound, not to stop the flow but as if to hold on to what was left of herself, and she whispered in her mind that she was not finished, that something must come next, though she did not know what that could be. It was then, in the stillness between pain and despair, that she sensed movement not far from her, footsteps that did not match the hurried rhythm of warriors locked in combat but instead carried a steadier, more deliberate weight, and though her eyes blurred she caught the shadow of a figure unlike those of her clan, tall and clad in armor that reflected the light differently, a stranger bending low as though to reach for her. She wanted to ask who they were, wanted to demand why they had come when even her kin had turned away, but her voice failed, only a broken breath leaving her lips as exhaustion closed over her like a tide. The last thing she felt was not the ache of her body but the strange sense that fate had not finished with her yet, that though her people might see her as broken, someone else still saw her as worth saving, and that thought lingered like a fragile flame as darkness finally claimed her. When Kayla opened her eyes again, the sky above her was no longer the smoke-filled battlefield she remembered but a dim ceiling of metal, strange lights humming softly above, and for a moment she thought she had already crossed into the silent afterlife her people spoke of, until the sound of unfamiliar voices reached her ears, voices that carried neither the harsh tones of her clan nor the guttural cries of their rivals but instead a measured rhythm that seemed both calm and commanding. She tried to move, and the sudden pull of pain reminded her that her body was not whole, her legs still gone, yet there was something different too, a pressure around her wound, firm and steady, holding her together in a way she had not expected. Turning her head, she saw a figure sitting near her, tall and broad-shouldered, his armor replaced by simple clothing marked with symbols she did not know, his face lined with focus as he adjusted a set of strange devices attached to her side. His hands moved with precision, yet there was no fear in them, only care, as though her broken state did not frighten or disgust him, and when he finally noticed her gaze he gave the smallest nod, his eyes sharp but not unkind. He spoke in words she did not fully understand, though some meaning reached her through tone alone, a reassurance that she was not abandoned. She realized then that this must be one of the humans, the outsiders who had appeared only in rumors within her clan, a people described as reckless, fragile, and yet unyielding, and though she had never seen one so close before, she now owed her life to the stranger's presence. Her first instinct was suspicion. Why would a human save her when her own people had walked away? Yet when she tried to speak, the words caught in her throat, her body still too weak, and instead he placed a small device near her mouth that released a mist cooling her chest, making it easier to breathe. Kayla's heart tightened, not from pain but from confusion, for everything she had been taught told her that those beyond her people could not be trusted, that they would never risk themselves for a warrior of another kind, yet here was proof before her eyes that contradicted it all. As she studied him, she noticed the lines of exhaustion etched across his face, the faint marks of ash on his hands, as though he had carried her from the battlefield himself through fire and chaos, and a thought struck her like lightning, perhaps to him she was not a broken warrior but simply a life worth saving. The idea unsettled her, for it was both comforting and terrifying to believe she might be seen differently than by her own clan. The human adjusted another piece of equipment, and suddenly she felt a gentle warmth spread through her body, not erasing her pain but making it bearable, as though he had found a way to shield her from despair itself. She wanted to ask his name, to know why he had chosen her when he could have left her, but fatigue pressed heavily against her, pulling her back toward the shadows, though not the same suffocating darkness as before, for this time she felt tethered by his presence, as if the world had granted her a fragile thread to cling to. Before sleep claimed her again, she caught one final glimpse of his eyes watching over her, not with pity but with determination, and she realized he did not see her as finished at all, he saw her as someone who still had a future, though what that future was she could not yet imagine. Kayla woke to the faint hum of machines and the soft glow of unfamiliar lights, her senses sharpening slowly as she became aware of the sterile scent in the air and the strange steady rhythm of her own heartbeat echoing through a monitor beside her, and when she lifted her head even slightly, she saw the human still there, sitting at the edge of the chamber, his expression calm but his eyes alert as though he had not truly rested since carrying her away from the battlefield. This time when he noticed her stir, he spoke again, his voice even, and though she struggled to grasp the full meaning of his words, she caught fragments through the translator embedded in the room, phrases like future, not over, and choice, which stirred a fragile flicker of hope inside her. Then he brought forward a small case, sleek and silver, unlike any tool or weapon she had ever seen, and when he pressed it open before her, Kayla's breath caught, for inside lay a gleaming shape of metal and fiber, delicate yet strong, formed in the likeness of a leg though clearly not of flesh. The human explained carefully, pointing and demonstrating with his hands, making sure she followed, and the translator filled in the gaps. It was a synthetic limb, crafted with human technology, designed not only to restore movement but perhaps to make her stronger than before, and for a long moment she could not breathe as she stared at the impossible object, because it was at once a gift and a threat. Among her people, tradition was clear, a warrior who lost part of their body was marked as broken, unfit to lead or fight, and no tool, no device, no replacement could change that in their eyes, yet here this human was telling her she could rise again, that her path was not finished if she accepted what he offered. Kayla's heart twisted with conflict. To take the synthetic leg would mean betraying the old ways, risking exile, yet to refuse would mean surrendering to a life of silence and shadow, never again standing on the battlefield, never again holding her head high among her clan. She looked at the human, trying to see what his true motive might be, but all she found was steady determination, a quiet insistence that life was worth fighting for, no matter how scarred or altered it became, and she wondered if this was the essence of humanity. She had only ever heard whispers about that they refused to yield even when the universe tried to break them. Slowly, Kayla reached out her hand, trembling not from weakness but from the weight of her decision, and her fingers brushed the cold surface of the artificial limb, sending a shiver through her as though she had touched both salvation and betrayal at once. The human did not pressure her, he only watched, waiting, giving her the power to decide, and in that moment she realized something no one from her clan had ever given her before: choice. Her people had already written her future the moment the mine exploded, declaring her broken, yet here was a chance to write it anew, to defy them, to stand again even if she no longer looked the same. Her chest tightened as memories of her past battles flickered in her mind, of the fire in her blood when she had led charges, the pride in her parents' eyes when she had been named a warrior, the laughter of her comrades who now would never look at her the same if she returned with this human-made leg. Could she live with their whispers, their scorn? Or was the greater danger living with her own silence, knowing she had refused to rise when she still could? The human spoke again, his words softer this time, and though the translator struggled to catch every syllable, one phrase came clear as crystal: "You are not finished." That was enough to bring tears to her eyes, though she turned her face so he would not see, for a warrior was not supposed to weep, yet the truth was her fear and her longing were waging war inside her, and she was caught in the middle. Slowly, she closed the case with her hand, not rejecting the gift but not yet embracing it fully, needing more time, more strength to decide, and the human simply nodded as though he understood, as though patience was a weapon he carried as easily as his tools. For now, Kayla lay back, her mind restless with the image of that gleaming synthetic limb burning into her thoughts, knowing that sooner or later she would have to choose whether to accept the path the human offered or let her people's judgment bury her before her time. When Kayla finally returned to her clan's territory, leaning on a simple support given by the humans until she made her decision about the synthetic limb, the silence that greeted her was heavier than any wound she had endured, for her people did not cheer nor rush to her side but instead watched with guarded eyes as if they no longer knew the warrior who had once led them with fearless strength, and in their silence she could already hear the judgment forming. The elders were the first to step forward, their robes heavy with symbols of ancient tradition, their faces lined with the weight of law that had governed their people for generations, and though they spoke softly, their words carried the sting of exile as they declared her unfit to lead, broken in body and therefore broken in spirit, unable to carry the banner of her ancestors. Kayla's chest ached as she listened, not because she had not expected it, but because the finality of their voices sounded like a burial of everything she had once been, and she could see her former comrades shifting uncomfortably, some with pity, some with shame, and others with a hint of fear, as though even standing near her might taint their own honor. She wanted to cry out, to remind them of the battles she had won, the enemies she had driven back, the sacrifices she had made, but she knew tradition was a wall no voice could break, and if she shouted until her throat bled, it would still stand tall against her. Yet there was something different in her now, something the elders could not see, for while they believed her path ended with the blast of the mine, she had glimpsed another path in the quiet patience of the human medic, a path of choice, and though she had not yet placed the synthetic leg upon her body, the knowledge that she could, that she still had a way to rise, burned inside her like a hidden flame. The elders ordered that she be moved aside, no longer a warrior but a dependent, destined to live quietly in the shadows of others, and though the words were spoken with finality, Kayla noticed the way a few younger warriors exchanged glances, as though the certainty of tradition no longer seemed so solid to them after all, perhaps shaken by the way she stood tall even in her brokenness. That night, as Kayla sat alone in the outskirts of the camp, the whispers of her people carried through the air like sharp knives, some calling her a ghost of her former self, others wondering if the humans had touched her with forbidden craft, and still others, softer voices, suggesting that perhaps she had survived for a reason, that perhaps there was more strength in her than the elders dared admit. Kayla clenched her fists, torn between despair and defiance, and the thought of the silver case the human had left in her care returned again and again, its promise echoing in her mind: she was not finished. When a young warrior she once trained approached her quietly, glancing over his shoulder to be sure no one watched, he asked in a low voice whether it was true that the humans had offered her a new leg, and Kayla, after a long silence, nodded once, watching his eyes widen not with disgust but with awe, as though the idea of such a thing was a spark against the dry wood of tradition. He whispered that perhaps the elders were wrong, that perhaps strength was not only in flesh but in spirit, and then he left quickly before anyone could see, but his words stayed with Kayla, a reminder that not every heart in the clan was chained as tightly as the elders believed. Still, the weight of their judgment pressed on her, and when the dawn came, the elders announced to all that Kayla was to be relieved of her titles, her weapons given to another, her name marked in the scrolls as one who had fallen though she still drew breath. The sting of that pronouncement cut deeper than the pain of her lost leg, yet she did not bow her head as they expected. Instead, she stood as tall as she could, her eyes unflinching, and in that moment some among her people looked away in shame while others stared with something dangerously close to respect, for it is one thing to lose a battle and another to lose dignity, and Kayla refused to surrender the latter. That night, with the silver case in her hands, she sat by the fire's edge, the clan's whispers swirling behind her, the elders' judgment weighing on her shoulders, and she realized that her choice was no longer just about herself, it was about proving whether a warrior's worth ended when flesh failed, or whether something greater could rise beyond the chains of tradition, and as the flames danced in her eyes, the question of what she would decide burned brighter than ever. Kayla sat with the silver case before her for many nights, her fingers tracing the strange marks on its smooth surface, each curve and symbol a reminder of the choice waiting inside, and though fear whispered that she might lose the last fragments of her identity if she accepted the human's help, a louder voice rose inside her that told her she had already lost more than enough by listening to the chains of tradition, and so at last, with a heart trembling yet determined, she made her way back across the barren field where the mine had shattered her life, traveling under cover of night so her clan would not see her departure, for this was not a journey they would ever bless. The human medic, a man named Elias, was waiting as though he had known she would come eventually, his calm eyes meeting hers without surprise, and when he opened the case and showed her the gleaming construct within, a piece of metal and fiber that almost seemed alive with a faint pulse of light, Kayla felt both dread and awe surge through her chest, for it was not just a replacement but a promise of something beyond what she had ever imagined. Elias spoke in a steady voice, explaining how the synthetic limb would connect to her body, how the pain would be sharp but brief, how her strength would return in ways her people might call unnatural yet no less real, and Kayla listened, not fully understanding the science but feeling the weight of trust settle in her bones, for this was not only about flesh and metal but about courage and will. When she finally lay down on the table in the human outpost, the air was thick with the smell of antiseptic and the hum of machines unlike anything her clan had ever seen, and though her heart pounded in her chest, she did not close her eyes but stared at the ceiling as the medic worked, guiding the cold construct into the torn edge of her body where flesh met machine. The first shock of contact was like fire racing through her nerves, a wave of pain so fierce it almost tore a scream from her throat, but Kayla bit down and refused to give voice to weakness, her fists gripping the edge of the table until her knuckles turned white. The machines pulsed, Elias's hands moved with precision, and the synthetic leg fused to her body in a way that seemed both terrifying and miraculous, light and electricity weaving with blood and muscle until she could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. Time blurred, and when the medic finally stepped back, sweat shining on his brow, Kayla realized she was breathing hard as though she had run a great distance, her whole body trembling, and yet beneath the trembling there was something new, an echo, a strength, a presence that had not been there before. Slowly, Elias helped her sit up, and when Kayla lowered her gaze, she saw the gleaming limb where emptiness had been, not ugly as she had feared but almost beautiful, its lines sleek and strong, its movements responsive as though it had always belonged to her. Her first step was unsteady, her balance uncertain, but the second was firmer, and the third carried with it a sense of rising power that made her eyes widen, for the limb was not merely restoring her, it was enhancing her, giving her strength that exceeded what she had once known, and in that moment Kayla understood that she was no longer simply the warrior she had been before the mine, she was something new, something her people had no word for yet. Elias warned her that it would take time to master, that she would need to train and learn, that others might not accept what she had become, but Kayla's mind was already racing ahead, imagining the look on the elders' faces when they saw she had not been broken but reborn. Yet even in her triumph, doubt lingered at the edges of her thoughts, for she knew the cost of stepping so far beyond tradition, and she wondered whether her people would see her as hope or as a danger to everything they believed, and that question, sharp as a blade, hung over her heart even as she took her first steady steps into a new destiny. When Kayla finally returned to the lands of her people, the battlefield still carried the scars of war, blackened soil and broken weapons scattered like bones across the ground, and the whispers of her clan had already begun to fade into stories of her disappearance, some saying she had died, others claiming she had fled in shame, yet none knew the truth of what she had become. Wrapped in a plain cloak, she walked among them unnoticed at first, her steps steady and deliberate, her heart beating with both fear and anticipation, for she was not sure whether she would be met with welcome or with rejection, and when the cloak finally fell from her shoulders and revealed the gleaming limb of metal and light that replaced her lost leg, silence fell like a storm across the gathering warriors. Some gasped in horror, others narrowed their eyes with suspicion, and the elders exchanged uneasy glances, their traditions screaming that she had defied the natural order, yet none could deny the strength in her posture or the fire in her gaze. Kayla stood tall before them, her voice steady as she declared that she had not returned broken but stronger than ever, that she had walked through pain and despair only to rise again with power none of them had dreamed possible, and though her words carried truth, the weight of centuries of belief pressed heavy on the air, leaving her people torn between fear and wonder. The trial came swiftly, for even as they debated, the rival clan launched a sudden raid upon their borders, warriors pouring across the plain with weapons raised, and Kayla, without hesitation, charged forward to meet them, her new limb carrying her faster than any had ever seen, her strikes landing with precision and force that turned the tide of battle in moments. Her people watched as she moved like a storm, leaping with unnatural agility, striking with strength beyond what her former body could have given, and for the first time they saw not a broken girl but a warrior reborn, and though awe grew in their hearts, fear did not vanish, for they whispered that she was no longer fully one of them, that something human and alien both lived within her now. Kayla herself felt the duality, every step on the battlefield reminding her that she was walking a line between two worlds, her blood and spirit tied to her clan while her strength came from the foreign hands of Elias, and as she cut down foe after foe, she wondered whether she was saving her people or changing them forever. When the battle ended and the rival clan fled in disarray, leaving behind their dead and wounded, Kayla stood at the center of the field, her chest heaving, her blade shining, her synthetic leg humming with faint light, and the silence that followed was heavier than any roar of victory, for her people now had to face the truth of what she represented. The young warriors looked at her with admiration, some even with envy, dreaming of the power she now carried, but the elders frowned, their voices low and uncertain as they argued whether such change was strength or corruption, and Kayla, standing apart, knew her greatest challenge was not the enemies on the battlefield but the hearts of her own kin. Yet even as doubts swirled, she felt a strange certainty rising inside her, for the path ahead would not be easy, but she was no longer afraid of their whispers, no longer bound by the chains of tradition that once tried to bury her, and though she did not yet know if they would ever accept her as she was now, She knew one truth with unshakable clarity, that she would never again bow her head in shame, for she had faced death, walked through fire, and returned stronger, and that was something no clan law could take away. When the smoke of battle cleared and the silence of the aftermath stretched long into the night, Kayla stood apart from her people on a ridge that overlooked the valley, her synthetic legs still faintly glowing under the starlight, and for the first time since the explosion she allowed herself to breathe without the weight of blades or commands pressing down on her. Yet even in that stillness she knew that the true conflict had not ended with the retreat of the enemy, for now came the moment of decision that would shape the rest of her life. Her clan gathered below, warriors and elders alike watching her as if she were a riddle they could not solve, some seeing hope in her victory, others seeing danger in her transformation, and she could feel their stares like 1,000 unspoken questions pressing against her back. Into that silence stepped Elias, the human medic who had given her a second chance, his presence calm but steady, his eyes never leaving hers, and Kayla knew without words what he was offering: a place among his people, where she would never be treated as broken, where her strength would be valued rather than feared. But the thought of leaving the land of her ancestors twisted like a knife in her chest, for every stone, every hill, every whisper of the wind carried the memory of her bloodline. She remembered the faces of the young who had cheered for her on the battlefield, the sharp glances of the elders who clung to their ancient rules, the laughter of her friends now turned quiet in her absence, and she realized that her return had stirred not only suspicion but something deeper, a question in their hearts of whether change could live beside tradition. The night stretched longer, the stars above glittering like cold watchers, and Kayla walked slowly among her people, listening to their words. Some pleaded for her to lead them with her newfound strength, others begged her to leave before her presence cursed them with foreign ways, and in every voice she heard both fear and longing, as if they could not decide whether to cast her out or follow her into the unknown. She turned then to Elias, and for a moment her heart wavered, for he represented a path of certainty, of progress, of acceptance, and yet his world was not hers, his ways not bound by the roots that held her soul to the soil of her clan, and she knew that no matter how far she walked beside him, some part of her would always look back. The dawn came slowly, painting the horizon with fire, and as the light fell across the valley Kayla made her choice, her voice carrying clear across the gathering as she declared that she would not abandon her people, nor would she reject the gift she had been given, but instead she would walk between the two worlds, carrying the strength of both within her, and though the elders bristled at such defiance, none could deny the truth of her victory, the proof that she was still one of them and yet something more. She vowed to use her power not to tear traditions apart but to protect the lives that clung to them, to show her clan that survival sometimes demanded change, and though she knew acceptance would not come swiftly, she was ready to fight for it as fiercely as she had fought on the battlefield. Elias bowed his head, understanding that though she had not chosen to leave with him, she had not rejected him either, for their paths were now tied by the bond of survival and respect, and he promised to stand at her side whenever she called. The people murmured, torn between fear and admiration, yet in their eyes she saw a spark, faint but growing, that told her seeds of change had been planted, and as the first rays of sunlight struck her metal limb, she did not hide it beneath a cloak but stood proudly, letting all see the union of blood and steel that defined her. In that moment Kayla knew the truth she had been searching for since the mine had torn her life apart: she was not broken, she was not cursed, she was not less, she was the bridge between two worlds, and whether her clan accepted it today or years from now, the future would remember her not as the girl who lost her leg, but as the warrior who refused to kneel to fate.